The kitchen was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall. Margaret sat at the worn oak table, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a faded photograph of her grandchildren, Tommy and Lila. Their smiles, Tommy's gap-toothed grin and Lila's shy dimple, had always been her anchor. At 70, Margaret had lived through enough to know that love was the only thing that truly tethered a person to the world. But now, that tether was fraying, and she felt herself drifting into an unfamiliar sea of grief. It had been 3 months since her daughter-in-law, Claire, had delivered the ultimatum. "You're too old to keep up with them, Margaret," Claire had said, her voice cold and clipped over the phone. "It's better for everyone if you stay away." The words had landed like a physical blow, stealing the air from Margaret's lungs. She tried to argue, to plead, but Claire was immovable. "You're not their mother. I am." And just like that, the door to her grandchildren's lives slammed shut. Margaret had raised her son, David, alone after her husband passed 20 years ago. She'd poured every ounce of herself into him, and later, into Tommy and Lila. She'd been there for their first steps, their bedtime stories, their scraped knees. When David married Claire, Margaret had welcomed her with open arms, hoping to build a family together. But Claire had always kept her at arm's length, her smiles polite but distant. Margaret had ignored the signs, convincing herself it was just Claire's way. Now, she saw the truth. Claire had been waiting for an excuse to cut her out. The photograph in her hands blurred as tears welled up. She remembered the summers spent with Tommy and Lila in her small backyard, teaching them to plant marigolds, their tiny hands covered in dirt. She'd saved every penny she could, squirreling it away into a secret college fund for them. It wasn't much, $20,000 over 10 years, but it was her promise to them. A legacy of love. She'd never told David or Claire about it, wanting it to be a surprise when the kids were older. But now, with Claire's words echoing in her mind, that fund felt like a weight, a reminder of a bond she was no longer allowed to nurture. Margaret set the photo down and wiped her eyes. She wasn't one to wallow. She'd survived too much loss, hardship, loneliness to let this break her. But the pain was raw, and it demanded action. She stood, her joints protesting, and walked to her desk. There, in a locked drawer, was the paperwork for the college fund. She pulled it out, her fingers tracing the numbers she'd so carefully tracked. An idea flickered in her mind, small at first, but growing brighter, fiercer. If Claire thought she could erase Margaret from her grandchildren's lives, she was mistaken. Margaret would find a way to leave her mark. She spent the next few days researching, her old laptop humming as she navigated websites she barely understood. She learned about trusts, scholarships, and charities. The college fund was in her name, her money, her choice. She could redirect it, give it to someone who needed it, someone who wouldn't turn their back on love. The thought brought a strange mix of guilt and defiance. Was she being spiteful? Maybe, but it felt like justice, a way to reclaim her dignity. By the end of the week, Margaret had made her decision. She contacted a local community center that ran programs for underprivileged kids. The director, a kind woman named Rosa, told her about their scholarship program for teens who couldn't afford college. Margaret's $20,000 could change lives, Rosa said, her voice warm with gratitude. Margaret felt a spark of purpose she hadn't felt in months. This was her answer, her way to honor the love she still carried for Tommy and Lila, even if they'd never know it. But as she signed the paperwork, a pang of doubt hit her. What if David found out? What if Tommy and Lila grew up thinking she'd abandoned them? She pushed the thoughts aside. Claire had made her choice, and now Margaret was making hers. She sealed the envelope, her heart heavy but resolute. The money was gone, redirected to kids who needed it, kids whose families wouldn't shut out love. Margaret didn't know if she'd ever see her grandchildren again, but she knew one thing: her love would live on, in ways Claire could never control. The days that followed were quieter, but the silence felt different now, less oppressive, more like a pause before a new chapter. Margaret started volunteering at the community center, teaching gardening to kids who reminded her of Tommy and Lila. Their laughter filled the hole in her heart, if only a little. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt like she was moving forward, not just surviving. The community center was a modest brick building, its walls covered in colorful murals painted by the kids who came through its doors. Margaret found herself there most mornings now, her hands deep in soil as she guided a group of teenagers through planting vegetables. It was hard work, but it grounded her. The kids, with their quick laughs and curious eyes, gave her something to hold on to. She'd started to recognize their faces: Jamal, who wanted to be an engineer; Maria, who wrote poetry in her notebook; and little Diego, who followed her around like a shadow. One afternoon, as she wiped sweat from her brow, Rosa approached her. "Margaret, you're a natural with them," she said, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "Have you thought about teaching a regular class? We could use someone like you." Margaret hesitated. She'd never seen herself as a teacher, just a grandmother who loved sharing what she knew. But the idea took root, much like the seeds she planted. She agreed to try, and soon, she was leading a weekly gardening workshop, her heart swelling with every question the kids asked. But at night, alone in her small house, the ache returned. She'd redirected the college fund, but the decision sat heavy in her chest. She hadn't told David yet. How could she? He'd always been caught between her and Claire, trying to keep the peace. Margaret knew he loved her, but he was loyal to his wife, and Claire's influence was strong. If he found out about the fund, would he understand? Or would he see it as betrayal? The thought kept her awake, staring at the ceiling as the clock ticked on. One evening, her phone rang. It was David. His voice was strained, hesitant. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked. Margaret's heart leapt, then sank. She invited him over, her hands shaking as she set out tea. When he arrived, he looked tired. His shoulders slumped. "Claire's been difficult," he admitted, avoiding her eyes. "She says you've been distant, that you don't care about the kids anymore." Margaret's breath caught. The lie stung, but she stayed silent, letting him continue. "I know that's not true, Mom, but she's not making it easy for me to bring them to see you." Margaret wanted to scream, to tell him about the fund, about Claire's cruelty, but she saw the exhaustion in his face, the weight of a marriage she didn't fully understand. Instead, she reached for his hand. "David, I love those kids more than anything. I always will. But I can't fight Claire if she doesn't want me around." Her voice cracked, but she held his gaze. "Just promise me you'll tell them I love them." "Okay." He nodded, tears in his eyes. And for a moment, they sat in silence, the gap between them both painful and familiar. When he left, Margaret felt a strange clarity. She couldn't control Claire, but she could control how she lived her life. The next day, she threw herself into her work at the community center, planning a new project, a community garden that the kids could tend and share with their families. It was her way of building something lasting, something Claire couldn't take away. As weeks turned into months, Margaret's life took on a new rhythm. The kids at the center became her extended family, their successes her pride. She helped Maria apply for a scholarship, using the connections she'd made through Rosa. When Maria got accepted, her hug nearly knocked Margaret over. You're like my grandma, Maria whispered, and Margaret's heart ached with joy and loss. She thought of Tommy and Lila, wondering if they'd ever know how much she'd fought for them, in her own way. But the past wasn't done with her yet. One morning, as she was setting up for her gardening class, her phone buzzed with a text from David. Mom, Claire found out about the college fund. She's furious. We need to talk. Margaret froze, her pulse racing. She'd known this day might come, but the reality of it hit like a storm. She sat down, staring at the text, her mind racing. What would she say? How could she explain a choice that felt both right and wrong? The community garden stretched out before her, green and alive, a testament to her new purpose. But the ghosts of her old life were closing in, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face them. Margaret stood in the community garden, her hands gripping a trowel as she stared at David's text. The words blurred together, but their weight was unmistakable. Claire knew about the college fund, the secret she'd kept for so long. Her quiet act of defiance was out in the open. She felt exposed, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. The kids around her were laughing, tossing dirt playfully, but their voices felt distant, drowned out by the storm brewing in her mind. She called David that evening, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Come over, she said simply. Bring Claire if she wants to talk. She didn't expect Claire to come. Her daughter-in-law preferred to wield her power from a distance, but Margaret was ready to face whatever came next. When David arrived alone, his face pale and drawn, she knew Claire had sent him as her messenger. Mom, why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice low but edged with hurt. That money, it was for Tommy and Lila. Claire's saying you stole their future. Margaret's chest tightened. Stole their future. The accusation was a knife, twisting deep. She gestured for him to sit, pouring tea she knew he wouldn't drink. David, I didn't steal anything, she said, her voice calm but firm. That was my money, saved from my own pocket, for kids I thought I'd always be part of. Claire made it clear I'm not. So I gave it to kids who need it, kids whose families don't push love away. David flinched, his eyes dropping to the table. She's not trying to push you away, Mom. She's just protective. Margaret almost laughed, the sound catching in her throat. Protective. Claire's words had been a wall, not a shield. But she saw the conflict in David's face, the way he was torn between his mother and his wife. She softened her tone. I don't want to fight with you, David. I did what I thought was right. Those kids at the community center theory getting a chance now because of that money. I couldn't let it sit there, tied to a future I'm not allowed to be part of. He was quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. Finally, he looked up. I don't know how to fix this, Mom. Claire's talking about lawyers, saying you broke some kind of trust. Margaret's heart sank. Lawyers. The idea was absurd, but it was Claire's style: control through fear. Let her try, Margaret said, her voice steady. The fund was in my name. I had every right to redirect it. But David, you need to decide what kind of family you want. One that shuts people out, or one that finds a way to hold on. After he left, Margaret felt the weight of her words settle over her. She'd meant them, but they'd cost her. The rift between her and David felt wider than ever. She threw herself back into the community garden, finding solace in the routine of planting and tending. The kids noticed her quietness but didn't pry. Instead, they shared stories of their own broken homes, absent parents, dreams they barely dared to voice. Margaret listened, her heart breaking and healing in turns. These kids needed her, just as she needed them. A week later, Rosa called her into the office. Margaret, the scholarship program just got a new applicant. she said, handing her a file. Her name's Lila. Margaret's breath caught. It couldn't be her. Lila, her granddaughter, was only 10. But the coincidence shook her. She opened the file, her hands trembling, and saw a photo of a teenage girl with shy dimples. So like her granddaughter's. The girl's essay spoke of a grandmother who'd taught her to love plants. A woman she hadn't seen in years. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't her Lila, but it could have been. That night, she wrote a letter to Tommy and Lila. She didn't know if they'd ever read it, but she poured her heart into every word, her love for them, her memories of their time together, her hope that they'd grow up knowing they were cherished. She sealed it and tucked it into her desk, a quiet promise to herself. She might not be part of their lives now, but she'd find a way to reach them. Someday. The community garden was thriving, a patchwork of green that drew families from across the neighborhood. Margaret watched the kids tend their plots, their faces lit with pride. She thought of the college fund, now scattered into the lives of these children, and felt a flicker of peace. Claire could keep her away from Tommy and Lila, but she couldn't erase the love Margaret was planting elsewhere. It was a small victory, but it was hers. The letter sat untouched in Margaret's desk, a silent weight that followed her through her days. She hadn't found the courage to send it, unsure if David would intercept it or if Claire would tear it up before Tommy and Lila could see it. Instead, she carried it in her heart, a tether to the grandchildren she loved but couldn't reach. The community garden became her refuge, its rows of vegetables and flowers a testament to what she could still build. But the threat of Claire's lawyers lingered, a shadow over her newfound purpose. One morning, as Margaret was teaching her gardening class, a man in a suit appeared at the edge of the garden. His presence was jarring, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the dirt. "Margaret Thompson?" he asked. His voice clipped. She nodded, her stomach twisting. He handed her an envelope, his expression neutral. "You've been served." The words hit like a slap. The kids watched, curious and uneasy, as she took the envelope with trembling hands. She didn't open it until she was alone in the community center's office, Rosa by her side. The letter was from Claire's lawyer, claiming Margaret had misappropriated funds intended for Tommy and Lila. It demanded the return of the $20,000 or face legal action. Margaret's hands shook as she read, anger and fear warring within her. They can't do this, can they? She asked Rosa, her voice barely above a whisper. Rosa, ever practical, shook her head. If the money was in your name, they don't have a case. But you should get a lawyer, just to be safe. Margaret nodded. But the idea of fighting Claire in court felt like a betrayal of everything she'd built with her grandchildren. She hired a lawyer, a kind man named Henry who worked pro bono for seniors. He reviewed the paperwork and confirmed what Rosa had said. The fund was legally hers to redirect. They're bluffing, Henry told her, his voice calm. This is about control, not law. Still, the threat gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the image of Claire's cold eyes, her determination to win at any cost. Margaret wondered if this was about the money or something deeper, Claire's need to erase her from the family entirely. The stress took its toll. Margaret's sleep grew fitful, her dreams filled with Tommy and Lila calling out to her, their voices fading as she reached for them. She kept teaching, kept tending the garden, but her smiles were harder to muster. The kids noticed, especially Maria, who lingered after class one day. You okay, Miss Margaret? She asked, her dark eyes searching. Margaret hesitated, then told her a version of the truth. Family stuff. Sweetheart, it's complicated. Maria nodded, her hand resting briefly on Margaret's arm. You're family to us. You know. The words were a balm, soothing the raw edges of Margaret's heart. determined to move forward. Margaret threw herself into a new project, expanding the community garden to include a small greenhouse. She rallied the kids, who were eager to help, and even got local businesses to donate supplies. The work was exhausting but exhilarating, a reminder that she could still create something beautiful. As the greenhouse took shape, she felt a spark of defiance. Claire could threaten her, but she couldn't take this away. Then came a surprise. One evening, as Margaret locked up the community center, she saw a familiar figure waiting by her car. It was David, but he wasn't alone. Tommy and Lila stood beside him, their faces shy but curious. Margaret's heart stopped. "Grandma." Lila's voice was small, uncertain. Margaret knelt, tears streaming down her face as she opened her arms. The kids ran to her, their hugs fierce and warm. David stood back, his expression unreadable. "Claire doesn't know we're here," he said quietly. I needed them to see you." They spent an hour together, sitting in the garden under the stars. Tommy talked about school. Lila showed her a drawing she'd made. Margaret soaked in every word, every smile, storing them like treasures. When it was time to go, she hugged them tightly, whispering, "I love you, always." As they drove away, Margaret felt a mix of joy and dread. This stolen moment was a gift, but it came with a cost. Claire would find out, and when she did, the storm would break. But for now, Margaret held on to the warmth of her grandchildren's embrace. A light in the darkness she wasn't ready to let go. The memory of Tommy and Lila's visit carried Margaret through the next few weeks. A fragile hope she clung to even as the legal threats loomed. She knew Claire would find out David wasn't good at keeping secrets, and when she did, the fallout would be swift. Margaret's lawyer, Henry, advised her to prepare for a fight. But Margaret was tired of fighting. She wanted peace, not just for herself, but for her grandchildren, who were caught in a battle they didn't understand. The greenhouse project became her lifeline. The kids at the community center threw themselves into it, their enthusiasm infectious. They painted the frame bright green, hung fairy lights, and planted herbs that filled the air with the scent of basil and mint. Margaret watched them work, her heart swelling with pride. These kids, with their resilience and dreams, were her family now, too. But the letter to Tommy and Lila still sat in her desk, a reminder of the family she'd lost. She decided it was time to send it. Consequences be damned. She mailed it to David's office, hoping he'd pass it on to the kids. In it, she'd written not just her love, but her truth, that she'd redirected the college fund not out of spite, but out of a need to keep giving, to keep loving, even when pushed away. She didn't know if they'd understand, but she needed them to know she hadn't abandoned them. The backlash came faster than she expected. A week later, Claire showed up at the community center, her face a mask of fury. "How dare you?" she spat, her voice echoing in the quiet office. Rosa tried to intervene, but Margaret waved her off. "Let's talk, Claire," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. They sat across from each other, the air thick with tension. "You had no right to take that money," Claire said, her eyes blazing. "It was for my kids." Margaret took a deep breath. "It was my money, Claire. Saved for them. Yes, but in my name. You told me I couldn't be part of their lives. I gave it to kids who needed it. Kids whose families don't shut out love." Claire's face flushed, but Margaret pressed on. "I don't want to fight you. I want Tommy and Lila to grow up knowing they're loved. By both of us. But you can't keep me out and expect me to play by your rules." For a moment, Claire was silent, her hands clenched. Then she stood, her voice cold. "This isn't over, Margaret. You'll hear from my lawyer." She stormed out, leaving Margaret shaken but resolute. She'd said her piece, and for the first time, she felt unburdened. Claire could fight, but Margaret had already won something more important, her voice. The community garden's grand opening was a week later, a celebration filled with laughter and music. The kids showed off their plots, and families from the neighborhood came to share the harvest. Margaret stood in the greenhouse, watching Jamal explain hydroponics to a group of parents. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Rosa, smiling. You did this. Margaret, you built this. Margaret nodded, tears in her eyes. It wasn't just a garden. It was a legacy, one Claire couldn't touch. That night, David called. Mom, the kids got your letter, he said, his voice soft. They cried reading it. They want to see you again. Margaret's heart leapt, but she braced herself. And Claire? She asked. David sighed. She's angry. But I think she's starting to see how much this hurts them. I'm trying to talk to her. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. Margaret hung up, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe there was a way forward, a way to bridge the gap. She went to bed that night with a flicker of hope. The garden was thriving. The kids at the center were thriving. And maybe, just maybe, her grandchildren would find their way back to her. She didn't know what Claire would do next, but she knew one thing: she'd keep planting, keep loving, keep fighting for the family she believed in every way she could. The seasons turned, and the community garden became a cornerstone of the neighborhood. Margaret was there almost every day, her hands in the soil, her heart with the kids who called her Miss Margaret, or, sometimes, Grandma. The greenhouse gleamed under the sun, a symbol of what love and resilience could build. But the shadow of Claire's threats still lingered, a quiet tension that Margaret carried like a stone in her pocket. She'd heard nothing from Claire's lawyers since their confrontation, but she knew better than to think it was over. David's calls became more frequent, each one a small step toward reconciliation. He told her Tommy and Lila talked about her constantly, sneaking her letter out to reread when Claire wasn't looking. They miss you, Mom, he said one evening, his voice heavy with guilt. I'm trying to make this right. Margaret wanted to believe him, but trust was fragile, and Claire's influence was strong. Still, she held on to the hope that her grandchildren might one day understand her choices. One crisp autumn morning, as Margaret was pruning roses in the garden, she saw a familiar car pull up. Her heart stopped as Claire stepped out. Alone, her face unreadable. Margaret braced herself, expecting another fight. But Claire didn't approach with anger. Instead, she stood at the edge of the garden, watching the kids work, her arms crossed tightly. Margaret walked over, her steps slow but steady. Claire, she said, nodding. What brings you here? Claire's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Margaret saw something other than hostility and certainty, maybe even regret. David showed me the kid's letter, Claire said, her voice low. They're hurting. Margaret, I didn't think it would be like this. Margaret stayed silent, letting her continue. I thought I was protecting them, keeping things stable. But I see what you're doing here. With these kids. It's good. The admission caught Margaret off guard. She'd spent so long seeing Claire as the enemy, but now she saw a woman struggling under the weight of her own fears. I never wanted to take anything from them, Margaret said softly. I just wanted to give them love, in any way I could. Claire nodded, her eyes dropping to the ground. I know. And I made it hard for you. I'm sorry. The apology was small, but it cracked something open in Margaret's heart. They stood there, two women bound by family but divided by pain. And for the first time, Margaret felt a flicker of understanding. Can we try again? She asked, her voice trembling. For Tommy and Lila. Claire hesitated, then nodded. I think we need to. For them. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Claire was still guarded, and trust would take time. But over the next few weeks, things began to shift. David brought Tommy and Lila to the garden, and Claire came too, watching quietly as the kids ran to Margaret, their laughter filling the air. Margaret taught them to plant sunflowers, just like she had years ago, and Claire even joined in, her hands tentative in the soil. It was awkward, fragile, but it was a start. The legal threats faded, replaced by cautious conversations. Margaret never got her college fund back, but she didn't want it. The money was doing good where it was, helping kids like Maria and Jamal chase their dreams. And in the garden, with Tommy and Lila by her side, Margaret found something even more precious, a second chance at family. She didn't know if it would last, but she knew she'd fight for it, not with anger or spite, but with the same love that had carried her through loss and loneliness. As winter approached, the garden lay dormant, but Margaret's heart was alive with possibility. She looked at the greenhouse, at the kids who called it home, at her grandchildren's bright eyes, and felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She'd lost something precious, but she'd built something new, not just a garden, but a legacy of love that stretched beyond her own pain, into the lives of those who needed it most. And in that, she found her redemption.